morning, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Lab 207 webcast. My name is Mr. Kite, and I'll be hanging out with you today as we start our final series for this class. Last topic of discussion is going to be biodiversity conservation, and we're going to start out with the bad news today. We're going to talk about the sixth mass extinction. So, as always, let me get you some objectives, and we'll get going. By the end of this video, you should be able to understand the factors contributing to the sixth mass extinction. So obviously we're starting out our series on a little bit of a down note, but I want to talk about the value of protecting biodiversity before we start talking about other stuff. Think way back in your brain to some of the first videos we watched. In those videos, we talked about biodiversity as having instrumental and intrinsic value. If you remember, instrumental value are the things that we can actually do with nature. So trees have instrumental value in that we can get lumber that we can use to build things. They have instrumental value in that they filter our air to make it clean. You could say that water has instrumental value because we drink it, we use it to water crops. So jog your mind and remember that instrumental value is direct value that you can use from nature. Nature also has intrinsic value, and that's value just for the sake of the thing itself. So we should protect natural landscapes because they are beautiful. We should protect animals because we don't have the right to harm them. So that is like the moral value side of things. Just recognize that through the rest of this video, we're going to talk about biodiversity as having both instrumental and intrinsic value, and therefore being worthy of protecting. And that's what we'll talk about for the rest of this series. I need to define a term for you as we get into today, and that is extinction. Extinction technically occurs when the last individual dies. Most of the extinctions that we're going to talk about today have happened since the year 1500 because we've got pretty reliable records starting in 1500. This little guy right here is one of the hallmarks for extinction. It is the dodo bird. I believe the dodo bird went extinct in the late 1800s or early 1900s, but this is kind of the symbol of one of the contemporary extinctions that has taken place. I want to give you some more facts on extinctions, things that you need to know about. Over the last 500 million years, through the fossil record, we know that there have been 5 major extinctions that have happened. We also know that currently we are in the middle of the 6th extinction. Roughly 50,000 species are going extinct each year, and that would be current data that we know about. And if we want to talk about that compared historically, the present extinction rate over the last 50 years is 100 to 1,000 times greater than historic levels. So scientists look back into the fossil record. They can use radiometric methods to date those fossils, and using those methods they can tell the period of time over which animals were starting to go extinct and disappearing from the earth. So using that historical record, we can look at what's going on now and come up with this number that animals are now going extinct 100 to 1,000 times more quickly than they ever have in history before. This is also the first extinction event that we have seen since humans have been on the scene. One of the biggest problems with mass extinctions or with loss of biodiversity in general is that gene pools become shallow, and this leads to low genetic diversity. With low genetic diversity, we get lots of problems. One of the problems that comes out of low genetic diversity is inbreeding depression. And what this is a gene pool that has been severely reduced. The animals within that gene pool reproduce with one another, and as they reproduce with one another, any faulty or disease-bearing genes that are in that gene pool can become more common than they would in the general population. So if you've got a big gene pool, it's not likely that 2 individuals that have got a recessive form of a genetic disease are going to get together. So they'll carry it around. It won't affect them. They won't pass it on to kids. But if you narrow down that gene pool so that you have got a few individuals breeding together, it's more likely that those 2 individuals that have got a diseased copy of a gene are going to mate with one another and produce offspring that actually show that genetic disease. So that would be an inbreeding depression. You also have lower adaptability, which is the idea that genetic diversity is the thing that natural selection works on. As environments change, animals that have traits that are beneficial to them are going to survive and reproduce. If the gene pool has low genetic diversity, then there is going to be less chance for animals to adapt to a changing environment. Same is true for plants. 2 examples of low genetic diversity, inbreeding depression, and the things I've just talked about are cheetahs and panthers. Cheetahs, we know, that for some reason about 10,000 years ago there was a genetic bottleneck that cut down a large proportion of the cheetah population. So the cheetah gene pool is very, very low. There's also the Florida panther, which currently inhabits just like the Everglades in South Florida, and there's maybe 80 to 100 individuals left in the wild. These panthers used to range across the southeastern United States from Texas to Florida and then up the East Coast. And one of the reasons that these panthers have decreased so much in numbers has been, one, hunting, because they eat our livestock, so humans have hunted the panthers, also destruction of their habitat. We can also talk about this with agriculture. Humans like to grow certain crops. We talked about the Green Revolution and higher productivity being focused on monocropping, which is growing just a single crop, usually the most productive crop. Now, for food production, this is great. Problem is that historically, farmers grew a lot of different varieties of food. With variety comes resistance to disease and stability in the case of, I don't know, a fungus wiping through your crop. Good example of reduced diversity in crops is that at the turn of the century, there were roughly 8,000 varieties of apples. Currently, farmers grow about 100 varieties of apples, and you might see 5 to 10 in the grocery store. So humans have really taken the gene pool of food crops and narrowed it down to the crops that are most productive. Problem with doing this with livestock or crops is that when you narrow that diversity down, if a disease comes through, it's much more likely that your crop is going to be wiped out. The ancestral species of a crop that would have normally grown in an area have the adaptations needed to survive the diseases that are in that area, or the environments or the climates or something like that. So in reducing the variability of our crops and our livestock, they become more susceptible to damage from the environment or pest or something like that. Another thing that goes along with the loss of this biodiversity is the fact that ancestral varieties carry variation that's needed for survival and flavor and nutritional content. Heirloom varieties, which are varieties that have been around forever and haven't been really put into mass production, have been shown to have greater vitamin content. They are more resistant to disease, and they are more adapted to an environment. Now, they may not be able to be raised as quickly or with the productivity of crops that we grow now, but they are more resistant overall. So one of the things that humans have started to realize is that we need to hold on to the seeds for all of these varieties of plants and animals, because as environments change, as diseases come along, it's going to damage the crops that we are currently relying on. If those crops are damaged and we have lost the ancestral versions, then there isn't like a gene library to look into and say, all right, what can we do to modify these plants so that they can handle the new adaptations? So a bunch of philanthropic organizations have got together and they've built these seed banks around the world. And these seed banks are in areas that are generally cold so that it will preserve the seeds. And researchers and scientists and the public send seeds to the seed vault for storage in case there is some collapse in a crop or famine that wipes out a bunch of different plant varieties. It's basically like an insurance policy against a changing environment. As crops become threatened, scientists can go into these seed banks, grab some seeds out from ancestral varieties, raise the plants, and then start researching the genome of those plants to see if there are genes in those ancestral varieties that can be transplanted into the modern variety in order to help it survive or be more productive. So this is one solution that humans are looking at to help maintain the biodiversity of plants and animals, mostly plants. I'm going to wrap up with a couple things. One of them is assessing biodiversity. A couple things that are difficult when it comes to assessing biodiversity. One, we can't range over the whole face of the earth and the bottom of the ocean, so we will never really know how many species there are on the earth. Roughly 10 million species are believed to exist. That includes everything from bacteria to blue whales. Presently, we only have really good information on about 50,000 of those 10 million species. Reasons that it's hard is you can't get data on all the species. There are new species being discovered all the time. Obviously, this work is expensive, so it's really hard to pin down good data showing us exactly what's going on with every species around the world. There are some broad categories of animals that we know a fair amount about. And before I talk about this graph, I need to give you a couple categories that are used to describe animals. So there is the data deficient category. Those are the ones that we don't know enough about. There is extinct, which are animals that have not got any individuals presently living on the face of the earth. There is threatened. Threatened animals are on the verge of going extinct. So those panthers that I talked about, where there's like 80 of them left in the wild, they would be considered threatened. There is near threatened, which is on their way to becoming threatened. And then there's least concern, which are the populations that are doing pretty good. So around the world right now, birds, here's what we know. Birds, we know that 79% of bird species are in that least concern category. 9% fall into the near threatened category, and 12% are in the threatened category. So comparatively speaking, birds are doing okay, but there's still, 21% there that are in trouble. Mammals, 68% of mammals fall into the least concern category. 7% are near threatened, and then 25%, so that's a quarter of all mammals on the face of the earth, are in this threatened category where they are on the verge of extinction. So around the world, about 32% of mammals are in trouble. Amphibians are the category that people point to and say, here's where we've got our biggest problem. Only about 50% of amphibians on the face of the earth right now fall into the least concerned category. About 8% are near threatened, and then 40% fall into this threatened category. So almost half of the amphibians on earth are in danger of going extinct in the near future. And the last slide for the day is talking about one more way that we know that we are losing biodiversity and that we are in the midst of a great extinction. This is looking at ecosystem function. There are roughly 24 ecosystem functions that scientists look at. An ecosystem function is something that the ecosystem does for us. We have talked about them as ecosystem services, so this thing includes things like filtering air, filtering water, providing food, all that. There are 24 ecosystem functions. Scientific research has shown that of those 24 functions, 15 of them have been in decline over the last 50 years. So of all of these things that the ecosystems do for us, over half of them have been shown to be on the decline. So that is our gloom and doom picture of where we are at. And we'll talk more about this in the coming videos. But for now, thanks for joining us on the Lab 207 webcast. My name is Mr. Kite, and I hope we'll see you again.